Thank you all for coming. I'm Susan Lawrence. I'm a specialist in Asian affairs at the Congressional Research Service. I'm delighted to be here to moderate this panel on the policy implications of the 19th Party Congress. We have three world-class experts on China here to join us for the panel. We have Ambassador Stapleton Roy, who is the founding director emeritus and distinguished scholar at the Kissinger Institute on China in the United States, former US ambassador to China, Singapore, and Indonesia. We have Richard McGregor, my old colleague from the press corps in China. He was with the Financial Times in China and then here in Washington, among many other postings. And he's the author of two absolutely must-read books. One, The Party, explaining how the Communist Party works in, what edition are we on now? No. Second edition?
Yeah.
Anyway, it's still a must-read. And he's got a new book out on China-Japan relations, which I think is outside in the foyer. And then we have David Dollar, who is here with the Brookings Institution, former Treasury Department Special Envoy to China, former World Bank Country Director for China, many, many years of experience looking closely at the Chinese economy. So we're talking about the policy implications of the Party Congress. I'm going to start by just highlighting some of what came out of the last week. We had Xi Jinping's 32,000-word report to the Party Congress, 63 pages in English, 3.5 hours, with a lot of detail about where he thinks China should go. We also got revisions to the party constitution that highlighted what in that 32,000 characters of report really matters. The big headlines, one, of course, was the writing into the constitution of Xi Jinping's thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. We got a lot of Chinese ambitions. China, Xi Jinping said, is going to be a global leader in innovation, a world-class science and technology country. China's culture is going to have greater appeal. There will be significant progress in reducing inequality. There will be a fundamental improvement in the environment. He said that in the period from 2035 to 2050, China will become a global leader in terms of composite national strength and international influence. And he said that China will achieve socialist modernization and national rejuvenation, which, as we know, includes the idea of unification, perhaps with Taiwan. There was a big emphasis on the party control, party conformity, the line, the party exercises overall leadership over all areas of endeavor in every part of the country. That was both in the work report and a revised addition to the party constitution. We had the new aspect of promoting China as a model for the developing world, a political model for the developing world. She said that China's socialism with Chinese characteristics, quote, offers a new option for other countries and nations who want to speed up their development while preserving their independence. There's a slight contradiction there, though, in that the report says that the defining feature of socialism with Chinese characteristics is the leadership of the Communist Party of China. So it's not quite clear how that applies to the rest of the world. There was a new principal contradiction rolled out. So the old contradiction, principal contradiction, which had been in place since 1956, had been between the ever-growing material and cultural needs of the people and backward social production. So now we have a new principal contradiction, which is between unbalanced and inadequate development, so focus on inequality and regional disparities, a contradiction between unbalanced and inadequate development and the people's ever-growing need for a better life. And the party broke that down as meaning economic, political, cultural, social, and ecological needs. So that was, the ecological piece was another big theme of the Congress. And finally, in the economy, we went from the previous party constitution had talked about giving play to, quote, the basic role of market forces. Now the new constitution says that the party will give play to, quote, the decisive role of market forces in resource allocation. So just to raise a few questions, big questions about what all this means, there's the question of Does this make Xi all-powerful, or is his power still constrained, and if so, in what ways? What is Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era? What exactly are the defining features of it? How do we understand this economic shift from the basic role of the market to the decisive role for market forces? And what are the implications of China's grand goals for US-China relations going forward? So Stape, if you could start, I think we're going to have each person speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll have discussion.
I'll try to stay within that. I'm going to put forward the proposition that the 19th Party Congress represented a giant step forward in demonstrating that China has the will, the resources, the leadership, and the timetable for playing a much more significant role on the world stage. But I'm also going to argue it represents a giant step backward in terms of the ideology underpinning that larger role on the global stage. In essence, the Party Congress marks a basic shift in the direction of China's development away from what I would call modern concepts that held back the development of the modern world for many centuries. This shift is designed to reduce the influence of Western values and Western models, which Xi Jinping, in my judgment, is confusing with modern values and modern models. Xi Jinping made clear in his work report to the Party Congress that China will not become more Western as it modernizes. Instead, it will become something distinctively Chinese, with the party firmly in control. In a sense, this is the culmination of the campaign against Western values and concepts that has intensified in China over the last couple of years. There were 77 references to the term "with Chinese characteristics" in Xi Jinping's work report to the Congress. Now, for several decades, China has been using the term socialism with Chinese characteristics to describe its move away from a centrally planned economy toward one significantly driven by market forces. But in Xi Jinping's work report, the term "with Chinese characteristics" is now applied to virtually every aspect of Chinese society, including its military forces, its major power diplomacy, its legal system, its political development, its institutional arrangements, its medical and health services, its culture, its philosophy and social sciences, and even its new types of think tanks. Now, those of you who are students of Chinese history will immediately recognize that this takes us back 2,300 years to the famous White Horse Dialogue discussed by the philosopher Gongsun Lung back in the 3rd century BC. He put forward the proposition of whether a white horse is a horse, since the quality of horseness does not necessarily include the attribute of color. In this sense, a white horse is not a horse, since a horse might just as well be black or yellow. Now, China has made great contributions to science and philosophy over the centuries. But one could argue that to insist that philosophy or science should have Chinese characteristics is a denial of the universal attributes of philosophy and science. Galileo encountered this difficulty several centuries ago, when the ruling power at the time insisted that science needed to have religious characteristics. And we are struggling with this problem in the United States, where we have the concept of science with Republican characteristics that rejects global change. Leaving these philosophical reflections aside, the message is clear. China intends to do things its own way. But paradoxically, President Xi Jinping also claimed that China's example, an example that must be imbued with Chinese characteristics, can serve as a model for other countries that want to speed development and maintain their own independence. In Xi Jinping's words, China is on a development path that is contributing Chinese wisdom and Chinese solutions for resolving the problems of mankind. Now, again, I raise the question of whether a white horse is a horse. The other key aspect of the work report is the emphasis on having the party in control of everything, as reflected in the following quotes. 1, it's necessary to adhere to the leadership of the party over all work. Another quote, among the party, the government, the military, the people, academia, and all circles, the party leads. In a separate passage, it said that the party had to provide guidance to virtually every aspect of behavior and thinking in China. Now, this is an implicit rejection of modern values because the heavy emphasis on doing everything in a Chinese way has a heavy dose of cultural chauvinism, an attitude that held back China's development for nearly a century. The emphasis on having the party control everything represents a rejection of modern thinking on the corrupting aspect of concentrated power, an understanding that is built into every modern political system. So in essence, the Party Congress is saddling China with an anachronistic political system. The Party Congress revised the party's constitution to include language making clear that the party must rule the party, and the party must be comprehensively and strictly ruled. So the 4 essential requirements that the party must meet, as outlined in the Constitution, they added a 5th one, upholding ruling the party by the party and practicing strict self-governance in every respect. Now, even the Romans 2,000 years ago were smart enough to ask the question, who guards the guards themselves? And there's some irony in the fact that by ignoring this question, Xi Jinping is putting China on a collision course with modernity. So there's an ideological problem that comes out of the Party Congress. Let me conclude my remarks just briefly by saying it's an extremely wrong approach to compare President Xi Jinping to Mao Zedong, in my judgment. Mao Zedong is not a model of a strong leader. He's a model of a successful revolutionary. Strong leaders in authoritarian systems, I would divide into 3 classes. Stalin is an example in a tightly controlled system of a leader who, through the purges from 1936 to 38, gained absolute control over the country and the party that he led, and he was not challenged from that point on until his death. Deng Xiaoping, in essence, did the same thing in China in a more relaxed approach to authoritarianism, because while he strongly believed in one-party rule by the Communist Party, he believed that that rule did not need to encompass every aspect of human thought and behavior, and he believed in letting 100 flowers bloom. And he was able to maintain continuity in policy direction and, with some bumps, essentially a smooth path toward rapid economic development. And Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore represents, in a very relaxed authoritarian system, a similar approach of being able to maintain stability and policy direction. Those are the types of leaders I think that Xi Jinping should be compared to, not to Chairman Mao, because he was not a strong leader. His last 15 years were marked by massive convulsions in China because of challenges to his leadership from within the Communist Party. So let me end on that note. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Richard.
Thanks very much. Honour to be on such a distinguished panel. I might say that Stape has already covered Galileo on the white horse, so I'm taking that out of my speech. I think we've heard a lot about Xi's ascendancy in the last couple of weeks, the elevated into the pantheon of Chinese leaders along with Mao and Deng. I'm not the first person, I think, to comment that Xi is no Mao and is no Deng. Mao was in power for decades. Deng Xiaoping as well for since 79 to when he died in the late 80s and the like. So I do agree that's quite a superficial comparison. I would focus on two themes coming out of the Congress. One is confidence, the other is centralization. Confidence. The Chinese state media has always contained lots of a steady diet of stern criticism of Western democratic systems. These days, I think it's become almost like outright trolling and mocking, such is the way they see their system working and others not. The point that Susan made about the decisive role for the market going into the Constitution, I think that is also a display of confidence. And I also think it's something that's often misinterpreted. I think the Chinese Communist Party talking about the decisive role for the market is not giving the market free rein, but it's saying they're going to be a greater role for the market without giving up or diminishing state power or agency. And I think there's a big difference there. That's another display of confidence. To state the obvious as well, in comparison with the US, with great respect, I'm not an American, but we have in China now the most disciplined leader in generations, atop of China, which is more powerful than it probably has been for 2 centuries. Frankly, in the White House, we have the least disciplined president in generations, and so far, given his record in Congress, quite ineffective. It was quite one striking difference this week. We all know, I think, some months after Mr. Trump came into office, his US Business Advisory Council was dismantled because of strong disagreements. After the party congress in Beijing, we saw Xi meeting with his American Business Advisory Council. Mark Zuckerberg, who can't even really do business in China, was there to sit through a sort of short lecture from Mr. Xi. Stephen Schwartzman, Hank Greenberg, Hank Paulson, and I think actually John Thornton was there. I saw him on the edge of the photo, so I think I should be diplomatic about it. But it was a striking comparison nonetheless, and these photos of US business leaders trooping off to China, I think, have become so pro forma that people barely remark on them anymore, and that's only a couple of weeks before Mr. Trump goes to China, in, of course, hoping to gain concessions from the same business people, for the same business people. As Stape said, there's much more confidence in the Chinese system itself. One of the remarkable things about China's success, as China has got richer, its politics gradually, I would argue, have become more illiberal. In the 90s, under Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji, people used to look back to the 80s as the halcyon days of liberalism in China. Once Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao were in power, people used to look back to Jiang and Zhu's time in power. These days, under Xi Jinping, people are looking back to Hu Jintao's leadership at a time when China was much more liberal and open. And in that respect, a lot of the coverage of the Congress had a sort of a sense of a whiff of the end of history Chinese style, like the Chinese model had finally emerged and was just about perfected. But I wonder whether that is really the case. On to the issue of centralization. This has been the theme of Xi's time in power, and I think has continued to be through the Congress. Centralization in the party, sidelining the State Council, centralization of power in his office as well, centralization in terms of technology and the internet. We've all heard of the BAT, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. These are near monopolies, but I think the party thinks that's great because you only need to call 3 people in China now to fix up the internet and a problem therein. I even saw an announcement, and I think Chung Li might have referred to this, about the PSB, the Public Security Bureau, that's now reporting not to the State Council and the Central Military Commission, but just the CMC. I'll finish just by talking about another issue which has been an issue of long-standing tension in Chinese policy making, particularly economic policy making, about the center versus local. One of the things which I think is pivotal to the economy and economic success, future economic success, revolves around fiscal policy and essentially how local governments can fund themselves in a sustainable fashion. I don't think it's unfair to say that Xi's global ambitions, which we've heard a bit about today, really depend in the long term about a healthy economy. Everything from the military budget to the Belt and Road Initiative and so forth needs continued sustainable, steady growth. We also should remember, I think, that in that respect, China is still in a rush. I know we hear a lot of talk about the economy slowing, a different model, et cetera, et cetera. We're still in a rush, I think, until about 2020. After 2020, the population is going to sort of start to fall by millions of people a year. The working age population is already falling. So all of that is important against this background. Xi Jinping, as party secretary, has enormous executive power in the political realm. Anti-corruption, putting his own people into various places, shaking up various ministries, et cetera, et cetera. The same kinds of executive power do not work so easily on the economy. You can't wave a magic wand and fix up economic problems, and you certainly can't wave a magic wand and fix up the issue of local government financing. Now, in that respect, we saw one of the other announcements which got a lot of attention this week was about the government saying that headline growth numbers no longer mattered so much. I didn't think that was actually very revealing, because this is something that they'd been saying for 10 years or so. And I also think to think about it in terms of headline growth numbers alone is misleading, because the local governments aren't simply going for economic growth. They're also trying to generate tax revenue. They have an enormous shortfall of taxes at a local level. You need money to fund education, health, laid-off workers, seed new industries and the like. And unless you can have that growth and fund those unfunded liabilities at the local level, then you're not going to succeed. So I think in many respects, we've heard a lot today about personnel and the like. All of that is very important. But I suspect Xi Jinping's future and his legacy depends much more on fixing the more mundane parts of the economy, and those are things that he cannot do with the sorts of power he's accumulated in the last week. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Richard. David, would you care to give us your thoughts?
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to join this panel and talk about the prospects for economic policy. Let me start by saying that there's a lot of uncertainty about what will happen with economic policy in China, probably even more uncertainty about outcomes. So I think no one can predict confidently what's going to happen, but we can analyze and speculate. So in that spirit, let me offer 3 points into the discussion. First, I think there's a very clear need for economic reform in China. The headline growth looks pretty good. It's almost 7% going through the 3 quarters of this year. But there are a lot of reasons why this current pattern of growth is unsustainable. Most importantly, it's taking a lot of credit to generate this growth. It's taking more and more credit to generate a consistent amount of growth. China's created excess capacity in a lot of different sectors. You hear about it in steel, but also I think they've overbuilt infrastructure and housing. You've got empty apartment buildings, empty cities. So you've got a lot of excess capacity, and in that environment, it's natural for investment to slow down. And they've been trying to gin it up to keep the overall growth rate up around 7, and that's led to this rise in leverage in the economy, manifested in rising debt to GDP, and probably most alarmingly, the big run-up in corporate debt relative to GDP. Now, the Chinese officials know about this. It was quite remarkable at our recent IMF meetings. Governor Zhou Xiaochuan of the central bank said publicly that China may face a Minsky moment in which asset prices collapse. It's quite remarkable to have a central bank head say this sort of thing in public. Now, I don't think there's an imminent danger of a crisis, and I think Governor Zhou does not think there's an imminent risk of a crisis. China has a lot of features that give it buffers. It's high savings rate, it's closed capital account. But I think they're right to be worried about this rise in leverage Earlier this year, Xi Jinping at a meeting said that financial stability is a national security issue, and I think he's right, and I think that puts this issue high up on the agenda. So they need to have some macroeconomic adjustment, slow down the growth of credit, and that's going to expose a lot of weak state enterprises. Xi Jinping in his work report said that enterprises needed to survive based on competition, and that creates hope that they might be willing to let some enterprises disappear. Now, there's also a micro agenda. That macro adjustment will naturally lead to a slowdown in the growth rate, and some of which will be healthy, but it can also be mitigated by opening up more sectors of their economy, which they keep talking about. Xi Jinping was talking about opening up the service sectors, and they do have very restrictive trade and investment policies when it comes to financial services, telecom, logistics, entertainment, social media, just a whole long list of mostly social sectors. So they definitely need reform. It's well known, if a lot of that was incorporated in the third plenum resolution a few years ago, there just has not been much action on this reform. Second point I want to make is that I think there's now some hope that they'll move ahead on that macro agenda. I view the balanced standing committee as positive for reform, because I don't see any of these factions as particularly reformist, and I think having balance on the standing committee creates a relatively good environment for reform. You've got personnel changes that are positive. Chung had penciled in Liu He as the vice premier, probably the one responsible for the financial system. You've got good candidates to replace Governor Zhou in the central bank. So they definitely could move ahead with tightening up financial conditions, allowing state enterprises at the local level to go bankrupt. I'm cautiously optimistic they'll move on that agenda because they recognize that it really is a national security issue. The third point I want to make is it's hard to be optimistic about that more micro agenda of opening up the service sectors and other market-based reform. Despite all the talk about more reliance on market forces, the previous two speakers talked very eloquently about a lot of the political developments. And Chung also talked about the industrial policies and the China Made in 2025 program. It's just hard to see that this leadership is really going to open up those service sectors. Many of those sectors I mentioned are quite political. Social media, financial services is the allocation of capital. So I suspect we'll see some small progress, but it's unlikely that this leadership is going to do anything dramatic about opening up the economy. And then the last point, just very briefly, that has implications for U.S.-China relations. Probably there'll be a little progress opening up some markets that the U.S. cares about, perhaps some parts of financial services that are not too sensitive. But if I'm right that it's unlikely that there's any big reform, then the U.S. is going to continue to face this issue of a small amount of progress in the economic relationship. Are you satisfied with that, or do you want to try to take some harsh protectionist measures to really change the situation? I personally would be against the harsh protectionist measures, but the point I want to make is this is the kind of decision the U.S. will probably have to face 6 to 12 months down the road. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, David. So we'll be turning to audience questions in just a few minutes. We've got about 45 minutes left in the panel. We're going to be ending at 11:45. Stape, I want to just start by asking you. China is declaring that it wants to become a global leader in terms of composite national strength and international influence. At a sort of meta level, how do you think that the U.S. should respond, or should it respond to the notion of China as the competitor, the near-peer competitor, the peer competitor going forward? Do you think this is going to have some kind of galvanizing effect on the national security side of the U.S. government in thinking about how to respond to China, thinking about U.S. primacy in Asia and elsewhere? What do you think that impact that kind of language might have?
I would like to say yes, but I can't. One would think that the rise of China would have galvanized us into action to address the factors in our own society that are holding back our ability to compete with a rising power such as China. And we are not doing so. We are essentially following the Soviet model where we are funding our military at the expense of our infrastructure, and as a result, we're ending up with poor infrastructure and we retain a powerful military. That was the Soviet Union that I lived in. Most Americans have forgotten how appallingly bad the infrastructure was in the Soviet Union, but their military was first class. And that's the model that we are pursuing, and it's the wrong model, because China is modernizing the country. The philosophical point I would make, because I think that Xi Jinping identified what I consider an important contradiction in China. He said it's the main one, which is the contradiction between the desire for a better living standard and the uneven development taking place in the country. He said in the new era, this is the principal contradiction. I don't think that's true. I think the principal contradiction in China is that the success of China under the reform and openness policies in modernizing the country, so that you now have vastly greater numbers of college-educated people, of people who have completed full high school. This is truly a miracle, but the party will not modernize its political philosophy and its concepts of ruling the country. That's the principal contradiction in China. It's the contradiction between its modernization of society and its non-modernization of its political concepts. And that's why I put emphasis on this factor, because I think this has implications for China down the road. But I think from the United States standpoint, we should learn from China in terms of, look at the 19th Party Congress. They set goals for 2020, for 2035, for 2049. They have policies that are actually geared to what they're trying to accomplish, which is raising living standards along with increasing comprehensive national power. We don't have anything. We don't have any long-term strategy. We don't have any programs to make sure that our infrastructure is better. We give lip service to it. We don't put any resources behind it. That's why I said in my opening comment, China has the will, the resources, the leadership, and the timetable to play a greater role on the global stage, and the United States is simply not intellectually coming to grips with that challenge.
Okay, dire words. Thank you, Steve.
Did I make myself clear?
I think so. I think so. And Richard, I just wanted to probe you. You were saying that you see much more confidence in the Chinese system itself. And I guess I've been sort of struggling with that a bit. I mean, clearly one of the propaganda themes running up to the Party Congress was that China now has self-confidence. This was the big propaganda word, self-confidence. You know, the Chinese are now self-confident. The party is self-confident. We're all confident. And there's something, a level where the system needs to tell us how often it feels confident that you begin to wonder whether it really is so confident, I guess. You did see references to a certain, I guess I sort of see a duality of China feeling at some level that it's coming into its own, that real success is on the horizon, but mixed with actually a lot of insecurity. And you see that in language about, you know, outdated thinking and institutional ailments and the need to break through blockades of vested interests and the problem of formalism and hedonism and all these sorts of things, right? That they clearly, there is some existential angst about whether the party really has it all together to achieve this grand goal. So I just wondered if you throw that at you and how you might respond.
Well, I think it's true that in China, the appearance of stability and the assertion of stability has always been an important part of having stability.
Right.
In other words, you know, it'll be stable or else sort of thing. And I think as far as the Chinese self-assessment of their own system goes, there's always been a strong dose of self-criticism attached to it. There's always been a lot of self-examination. There's always been, I think, a lot of enunciation of their own problems and the like. And there's always been a healthy degree of paranoia and insecurity, which I think is not just hidden, but is in fact articulated. But even given that, I think the balance out of this party congress, be it out of reality or in the management of it, the display of confidence, I think, has far overwhelmed the sense of insecurity. And I guess for good reason. For 5 years, they've still had strong economic growth. They had a mini financial crisis a couple of years ago. That seems to have passed. And of course, the greatest competitor, Western democracies, are in disarray. So in that respect, I think the balance is much more towards confidence.
Okay. And finally, I wanted David to actually take a quote from Richard and ask you to maybe parse it. Richard was saying that he sees this notion of saying that the party controls everything and yet at the same time saying that the party will give play to the decisive role of the market in resource allocation. Richard parsed that as a greater role for the market without giving up state power or agency. Is that do you agree with that rationalization of those two seemingly contradictory impulses?
So I think in thinking about whether there's contradiction to have this much state and party control, I would go back to my distinction between macro and micro. I think governments are always very powerful in the macro sphere. Most importantly, running the central bank. We talk about our central bank being independent, but that's within a framework in which president nominates governors and the chair, and these are confirmed by the Senate. And I think that that's one of the most powerful macro tools that we have is the financial policy, which then affects exchange rate policy, and of course you have fiscal policy. So I've always found that a little bit mystifying that the communist leadership didn't rely more on those kind of macro tools. So if you want to direct things, using interest rates, the exchange rate, fiscal policy, all of these things are powerful ways that a government or a ruling party can legitimately affect the economy. Interfering in the micro decisions, that almost always works out badly. You can point to some examples where China's developed solar panels, for example, but they've wasted a lot of money in their various industrial policy schemes. I'm always impressed when I travel around Guangdong at how much authentic Chinese private sector there is. So I see, the glass is half full in China. So the challenge for analysts is, do we think they're doing so well because they have this really smart communist party running everything? Or do we think they're doing well because they've opened up enough space for private initiative and market forces? And I generally subscribe to the latter view, but it's definitely worth debating.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
You could sum up, can I say the end of that there? I mean, we often hear the party has lifted 700 million people out of poverty. You could also say 700 million Chinese lifted themselves out of poverty once the party got out of the way. So I lean to the latter as well.
I'd just like to add one point on this. I think you can interpret the 19th Party Congress as a retreat from the third plenum in terms of the emphasis on the market. Because at the third plenum, it said very clearly that the market should be the decisive factor in setting prices and in the allocation of resources. They have retained the statement about the allocation of resources. They have backed away from the setting of prices. There was a reference to it setting prices for the factors of production, but not for prices more generally. So I think, and they have put the party in control of the market. So in essence, we have a contrast between the market as defined by Adam Smith, which was the invisible hand, and we have the visible hand of the party in China that's supposed to control the market. And perhaps it'll be more efficient than the invisible hand, but we'll have to wait and see.
I was actually struck that the new party constitution has a whole long, fat paragraph on exactly how the party should exercise its leadership within state-owned enterprises. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to open it up to the floor. I had an initial hand way in the back on the right that's been up for a while, so we'll start there. And if you could identify yourself when you ask your question, that would be great.
Thank you. A reporter from The Voice of America. I have a question concerning China's international influence. Chinese President Xi Jinping mentioned in his speech that China is moving increasingly closer to the center of the world stage. Yet at the same time, he is saying China is stick to everything with Chinese characteristics. So my question is, do you think the rest of the world can accept China's leading role in world affairs? And my observation is, most of Chinese neighbors sort of hedging China rather than bandwagging with it. Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch the last bit of that. You said the rest of the world is hedging?
Hedging.
Hedging. Okay, against Chinese leadership. Got it. Okay. Maybe we'll take maybe 2 or 3 questions at a time because we've got a lot of questions out here. So we're going to go with Julia and then Chris, and then we'll get the panel to respond.
Julia Chang Block, U.S.-China Education Trust. I have a related question. Xi Jinping clearly posited that China now offers the world, particularly the developing world, another alternative, another model of development. So how do you think China will do in terms of winning that, what would you call it, dance?
Okay, thank you. And Chris Nelson.
Thanks so much. Chris Nelson, Nelson Report. Stape, I wish I could have just transcribed every word and got that into the political discourse. Thank you. My question is, you've noted that there's a large business delegation in China now, and that Trump's bringing a whole bunch of them. What is your sense of the role of the American business lobby now in China, making China policy here, influencing Congress? We used to talk about the China lobby. It used to be really strong. We all remember the WTO debates and votes in 2000, 2001. It was led by the business lobby. I've argued that the business lobby died with the Indigenous Innovation Project. And if you look at the white papers of the AmChams, since then, they're increasingly critical and detailed and very, very concerned. Is that going to change? Are we going to see a return to a, quotes, business lobby that is worried about the U.S. backtracking now on the global system, pulling out of the WTO? I'm trying to get my head around how it's going to work here now. Whether or not Trump is the new normal, we'll set that one aside. So thanks.
All right, and I think Li Cheng, did you want to add something quickly?
I'm sorry, yes. Sorry. Okay. Yes, please.
Well, first of all, congratulations for each and every one of you for really very insightful comments. I learned a lot from all your presentations. I have a question for Ambassador that I'm so glad you discussed that the consequences, the foreign impact about the ideological indoctrination, etc. I hope the Chinese leader will listen to you very, very carefully. Now, but there's one issue I just wanted to ask, which I feel is, now you talk about contradiction, I think it is contradiction. Yes, it's true that China, or the document, the party constitution, emphasize on the socialism with Chinese characteristics. But at the same time, there's a lot of emphasis on rule of law. As we know, among many traditions in China, rule of law is not a Chinese tradition. It's largely come from the West. And Chinese leaders will not deny that. They did not say that rule of law was Chinese characteristic yet. Probably they will say it in the future. But if you look at China's,
the speech, the work report, talks about rule of law with Chinese characteristics.
Okay, so but you look at the constitutional review process, you look at the judicial development, you look at the teaching materials in Chinese universities. I mean, without that, there's no such a Chinese law you can be taught. So now you see the personnel moving, from the legal profession. So my question is, all these things are just a show, anything but a show, or is there something very, very important? Could you completely eliminate the possibility that Xi Jinping's second term will have some important development? Of course, I'm not naive to think that any country can make a jump to rule of law, and Xi Jinping, so far in that record, is mixed, to say the best, to say the least. And but I think there's a contradiction here. With the strong emphasis on rule of law. This is part of the constitution. Yes, Chinese Communist Party claim that the party should rule everything, but also there's a language in the Xi Jinping's report saying that no individual, no institution, no organization should above the law, above the constitution. So how could you reconcile this contradiction?
Okay, so just to sum up, we've got 4 questions. China moving to the center of the world stage, can the world accept Chinese leadership? the Chinese model, can it be successfully exported? The American business lobby, to what degree, what role will business interests, U.S. business interests play in the U.S.-China relationship going forward? And then Li Cheng's question, how seriously should we take the rule of law language in the work report and the party constitution revisions? Do we want to, Stape, do you want to start?
Yeah.
Yes.
First on the global role aspects. China's growing international influence is not a function of its growing military power. It's a function of the success of its economic development, which has made it the major trading partner for countries throughout the world, including virtually all of U.S. allies and friends. They have more trade with China now than they do with the United States. The question of whether a model with Chinese characteristics will take hold in the world is a more complicated question, because this is not Chinese characteristics. This is Chinese characteristics as determined by the party. Now, just for example, culture with Chinese characteristics controlled by the party will not be viewed as culture anywhere in the world. It will be viewed as propaganda. And that's a problem that will apply to any other aspect. If we have Chinese science that denies certain aspects of science because they're considered by the party to be non-Chinese characteristics, we have controlled science. And in the Soviet Union, that gave rise to Lysenkoism. That's science controlled by the party. So I think that China's model is going to flow from its economic success, not from its demonstration that everything has to have Chinese characteristics. To go to Chris's question, very briefly, we can't talk about Chinese policy, Chris. We don't have the policy positions filled in the U.S. government. And until we have those positions filled, we don't know what Chinese policy is. So I think the business community is watching what comes out of the summit from November 8, 9 in Beijing between President Trump and the Chinese will show us on terms of trade and other issues. But we won't be sure that that represents a policy until we have more fleshing out of the government. Your question, Chung?
About rule of law. How seriously do we take the rule of law language?
It's not rule of law. It's the old Chinese concept of rule by law, going back to the legalists. You cannot have rule of law unless the law is placed above the party, and the party will not permit that. So the closest they get, they repeated some of the language from the third plenum about legal reform in the work report speech. It refers to exercising power in the sunshine, exercising power within a cage. So they're gradually introducing a few elements of checks and balances, but they won't put law above the party. The party is not ruled by the people, it's ruled by the party. And that is not ruled by law, rule of law, that's ruled by law. What they're hoping to do, there's an irony. I mean, I really want to emphasize this point. Xi Jinping has been carrying out a massive campaign, the longest one and the most successful one, you could argue, in Chinese modern history, against corruption, because the party has been corrupted from top to bottom. And yet this is the party that's supposed to rule itself.
And that actually the party ruling itself is emphasized repeatedly.
He has two concepts. The party must rule itself, and the party must be strictly regulated.
By itself.
Yes. And the two are contradictory, because who guards the guards?
So Richard and David, maybe you could both take on particularly the business community question.
Can I say something on the model part?
Yes, of course.
Sorry about that. I think there's two parts to that. Obviously, China as a developing country has a great amount to teach other developing countries about how to manage their economies or how to build their economies, various policies which they've tried, the way of experimenting and the like, managing capital controls, et cetera, China in that sense is a massive success story. They've got a lot to teach the rest of the world. As to a Chinese political system, I would say no on this level. I mean, ask yourself a simple question. Could the Democratic Republic of Congo have an organization department? I would say no. They don't have the bureaucratic or Leninist roots in most of the other countries which can replicate the Chinese system of government. Replicating the so-called Beijing consensus, I think, for a lot of would-be dictators is it's kind of like, well, yes, I'd like to be an authoritarian country and have 10% growth a year as well, thank you. But not everybody can do that. A third point, of course, I think Xi Jinping in some respects has been following other world leaders like Mr. Putin and Erdogan in Turkey, strategically eschewing succession planning. I don't know whether that's a great model either. Just one other point. Superpowers have their prerogatives. The US has always had its prerogatives around the world. China is also becoming a superpower. I think in many respects, and many countries have railed against this, in some cases they would complain about the US in the past having extra territorial application of its law. I think what we're getting in China, with China, and I haven't really thought this through, but I'm thinking about it, we're getting the extraterritorial application of its political system and its politics onto countries which dare to disagree with issues, Tibet, Taiwan, whatever, which it regards as core to its political system. And that's a different kind of superpower pressure, which Western countries are all struggling with at the moment.
Yeah. On the first question about moving to the center of the world stage, I would add that China's playing a greater and greater role in the global economic institutions. So it's very active in the World Trade Organization. It's becoming a key player in the International Monetary Fund. And I think in general, the world is very welcoming for China to play that role. It created a little bit of a brouhaha when it started the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, but we have a system with multiple development banks, so I don't see that as a challenge to the international order, and the fact that now more than 60 countries have quickly signed up suggests that there is quite a welcoming of that particular initiative by the Chinese. Now, on the question about the business lobby, so I had three immediate thoughts as you were talking. We have this constant stream of American CEOs who go to China, and I've sat in on some of those meetings. They're generally very fawning of the Chinese leadership, telling them how wonderful they are, and it's too bad the United States can't get things done effectively.
Name names.
No, you name names. I'm not naming names. But then you mentioned, for example, the AmCham white paper. That's done by more of the level of management that's actually dealing with China, particularly on the ground. They're increasingly frustrated, increasingly unhappy, and I think their voice resonates back with Congress, that they see the American business community is frustrated, and the European business community. But the last point is, I suggested that down the road, the U.S. is going to have to make some fundamental decision. China's not going to open up the way that President Trump wants. The U.S. is going to have to make a fundamental decision. When that happens, the business community will be saying, do not have a trade war with China. They may be frustrated, but they're certainly not going to want a trade war with China.
Great.
Yeah.
Can we
Amen.
take now another round of questions? Okay. Let's go. This gentleman in the middle towards the back here with your hand up. Yep. Start.
Hi there. My name is Michael, a recent graduate student from American University. I was just curious, for the Hong Kong watchers, Taiwan watchers, and then human rights watchers, what are some key takeaways from the 19th Party Congress? Because I just haven't heard much said about that. Thank you.
Okay. So Taiwan and Hong Kong, was it?
And human rights.
And human rights. Okay. Got it. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Pete Shutley, retired State Department and retired Brookings. Chang Li mentioned how many of the leaders in the Central Committee and Politburo were educated in the U.S., graduate schools in the U.S. My question is, what implications does that have for their policies? A knee-jerk assumption would be that Chinese leaders, those that had college experience in the U.S., are more favorable toward democracy, pluralism, human rights. Is that an accurate guess or not?
Okay. And let me see. Very back row. We'll take 4 questions this round, so we'll do the back row, and then...
Hi, Greg Strasser from Shanghai Media Group. Regarding David Dollar's opening remarks, you've identified several key areas in economic reform that need progress, but are there some positive components of the Chinese economy, and if so, what are they doing right, and what do they need to continue doing? And for the rest of the panel, Mr. Trump is expected to push trade with President Xi Jinping during his China trip. They seem to have a contradictory relationship where Trump talks often about how positive their relationship is, it's the best among world leaders, but some of the things that he says doesn't really reflect that necessarily about China. So it's very clear that America has a lot of expectations for China. What does China expect from America in return? Thank you.
Okay, the last question here at the front.
Mike Macetic, PBS Online NewsHour. Was it a 90-10, 80-20 percentage breakdown in terms of how much the documents coming out of this party Congress reflected confidence in their own future versus feeling of decline, particularly in the decline and disarray in the United States?
Okay. So we have what do we learn about Taiwan, Hong Kong, human rights policy, what's the impact of Western education on some of these leaders who are coming in, including on human rights, so 2 human rights related questions. What's China doing right with its economy? What's positive? And what does China expect in return? And then this last question, so I'm suddenly blanking, sorry. Confidence. That's right. Confidence in China's own system versus sort of looking at this perception of U.S. decline. David, you're leaning forward.
Okay, why don't I start this time? So concerning the question about the leaders educated in the U.S., so I'm not sure I have a strong view on that, but I really found interesting in Chung's presentation that they used to all be engineers at the top. And I know what he's talking about. I remember sitting through meetings with top leadership, and they always had engineering solutions. You know, there's not enough water in Beijing, so let's dig the world's longest canal. You know, instead of economic solution, we raise the price and let people move away to parts of the country that have more water. So I hope the rise of economists will have a positive influence. The question, thank you for the question from Shanghai Media. You know, I quickly jumped into some weaknesses and problems, but it's nice to be reminded that there are lots of strengths in the Chinese economy. My quick reaction to your question is, you know, the labor market is tightening in China because demographics mean that the labor force is not growing. It's not growing rapidly. It's not really growing at all anymore. And a lot of this growth of the service sectors is generating employment. So you've got a nice virtuous circle going where wages are going up, consumption's rising rapidly. Consumption is mostly services, and that generates employment. And so there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic that we're seeing this transformation away from the old focus on heavy industry and investment toward the services and consumption. And then my comments were aimed at, but they still keep trying to generate more investment than's really necessary, and they could really buy into this new model, but they've got that fundamental strength there that should enable them to continue to grow well. And then anytime you travel to China, you see these wonderful new innovations like the bike rental system. There's just a lot of private sector dynamism still in China. So a lot of good fundamentals there.
Sure.
Could I comment on
Yes.
the Taiwan aspect? Overall, Xi Jinping's comments on Taiwan I thought were moderate in the work report. He reaffirmed the mainland's policy of peaceful unification. He repeated Beijing's willingness to deal with anyone and any party on the basis of one China and/or the 92 consensus on one China. Now, the problem, of course, there is that the president of Taiwan has not been willing explicitly to endorse the 92 consensus. So there's a problem there, but the Chinese policy has not changed on that question. There was a change, however, that's significant, although it was not stated with urgency, shall we say. In the work report, there was a statement that realizing complete national unification is an inevitable requirement. The Chinese was 必然要求, an inevitable requirement for completion of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people. Well, the goal for rejuvenation, great rejuvenation, is 2049. So in essence, he's saying that by 2049, when we're going to complete the great rejuvenation, we need to have completed national unification. That amounts to setting an implicit deadline. That's dangerous because we're talking about something only 32 years away, and the trends in Taiwan have been that there has been this enormous development of common interest with the mainland, and there's enormous support in Taiwan for maintaining the status quo in the cross-strait relationship, but there's been no growth in support for unification with the mainland in its current form. And so therefore, if the deadline were to be held firm and we didn't have developments in Taiwan, we have a potential contradiction. But again, we're talking about 32 years is forever in the American view because we can't think 3 to 4 years in advance.
I have to say, I was struck that she has talked elsewhere about this idea of national rejuvenation, including Taiwan's return to the motherland, this idea of unification. And I sort of felt that in the Taiwan section of the work report, it actually was just a little bit less explicit than he's made it elsewhere.
The comment he's made before that is relevant to this language was his statement that the Taiwan issue could not be left for future generations.
There's that too.
Which was was taking the Deng Xiaoping comment about the territorial disputes with Japan, that they were too complicated and should be left for future generations. And he moved that into the current generations, which in a sense set an implicit deadline. But the difference is here he's linking it to national rejuvenation, which has a deadline, and therefore it represents a step closer to beginning to say it has to be done by such and such a time.
Although interesting, he didn't sort of link them as closely in the Taiwan section. I think that's elsewhere in the report, but in the Taiwan section he's reaching out and sort of, he's got his 6 NEs. I think the biggest applause line in the report was the line, "We will never allow anyone, any organization, or any political party at any time or in any form to separate any part of Chinese territory from China." And that was the biggest applause line.
On Hong Kong, I didn't see any changes in the work report other than a very clear statement of China's basic position on it.
And basically, I guess it was doubling down on one country, two systems.
Yes.
Works. The practice of one country, two systems in both regions has been a resounding success, said the work report. On human rights, I mean, I think all this language about rule of law that Li Chang is pointing to is trying to respond to a sense that people in China are looking for a more predictable, fair, equitable sort of deal with the government. And so there's a sense that, in that sense, that has implications for human rights. Although I don't think he's thinking that language is not about human rights in the sense that we might think of rights, say, for dissidents or for people who peacefully oppose certain aspects of the Communist Party's rule. But it's more for sort of ordinary people, just so that in their ordinary dealings in life, to have perhaps the system be a little less, a little more equitable. And more predictable. So I don't think we had any big breakthroughs on the human rights front.
Can I say something on that
yes,
too? I mean, and also to the point on human rights, I think is that the US-China relationship is much bigger, far more complex. The issue of human rights you don't hear so much about, I think, because it's drifted down, relatively speaking, the agenda. Leverage over China with China is palpably less than it was, and it was never that great anyway. State would know far more about this than I would. So I think that's one point. On the issue of education, I think there's no evidence really that the legions of Chinese educated here have gone back to China with the aim of transforming the political system.
Yeah.
They have all received excellent educations, by and large, I would say. And excellent technical educations, and that's been useful for China, but it's not about changing China politically. But I'll make one other point on that, which is interesting. When I was in South Korea spending time there recently, the country with the most foreign students inside China is South Korea. But you get no sense out of that South Korea that there's been any sort of palpable Chinese influence, soft power influence back into South Korea because of that. It's almost all sort of utilitarian language learning, doing business, doing trade, and nothing about Chinese values, so-called Asian values, whatever, coming back into South Korea and changing it. Whereas, of course, education from South Korea, Taiwan, in the US had a much bigger influence.
Although you could say that maybe it's had influence in other places. The president of Ethiopia had studied in China and implemented some aspects of the Chinese experience there. Okay, we've just got about 10 minutes left, so if we can have a couple of. Oh yes, we had.
Well, Mike's question, Mike, I would say if it's a zero-sum game, strong China, weak America, I would say 60-40. Strong China, weak America. But there's no wisdom in that, my answer.
It's actually, and you were asked about in the documents. And in the documents, I mean, there is an explicit discussion of weak America, but that's that's kind of more, I think, in the way some people are interpreting some of the statements China's making, that maybe China's making them because it perceives a weak America, and therefore it feels emboldened to push forward with a more ambitious set of goals. Okay, can we have one quick question here, sir, and one back there?
Steve Winters, consultant. I'd like to direct this to Mr. Dollar. And just would you agree that there might be an alternate view to the one that you expressed about the technocrats? Because I remember the member of the U.S. Presidential Commission on Science and Technology Education in the U.S. was on a trip to China during this period of the height of the technocrats, and the people on the Politburo said, "Oh, it's so terrible, it's so terrible. We're all engineers, but our kids all want to be investment bankers like the guys in New York." And, you could just make the alternate argument that a lot of this wonderful growth they had was due to the fact that they had people with engineering degrees. Just saying. Is there another view there?
And I just mentioned one of my favorite quotes. I did a series of interviews with colleagues, a series of interviews with Jiang Zemin back in the 1990s. In the first interview we had, there was some question about whether Jiang Zemin would be staying in power. He'd been put there by Deng Xiaoping after the Tiananmen crackdown. And he had this great line. He said, "I am an engineer, and there's a rule of engineering." He said, so basically, I am a large mass. And then he told us exactly how much he weighed in kilograms. He said, "I am a large mass. Large masses are not easily moved." And that was, as an engineer, that was his take on his political future. Sorry, and we had one more question back here. Yes, sir. Sorry, the lady in white scarf.
My name is Wei, and I'm just a recent graduate from Johns Hopkins Science. So I do have a question about the U.S. and China cooperation in the short term. And given that the two countries are facing a certain level of pressure from their domestic issues, and also the two presidents have very different ideology in dealing with their future issues through modifying their roles in the global stage. So my question is, in the short term, especially regarding to the trip that Mr. Trump is going to have in Asia in the early November, is it possible that we are going to see the creation of some specific plans that is going to facilitate the economic cooperation activities between two countries instead of just big plans, ambiguous without strategic content? Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes for a quick response on the take on technocrats. What do we think? How do we understand how they behave? And then on specific plans to facilitate economic cooperation between the U.S. and China, can we expect anything like that coming out of the Trump visit to Asia?
I'll venture
Everyone can get 2 minutes of response, and then we'll wrap up.
Quick comment on it. China has in place what is the most important factor in dealing with this administration, which is a good relationship between President Xi Jinping and President Trump. President Trump has made it clear that he respects the views of President Xi, and therefore I think that we can expect that that factor will help to stabilize the visit to Beijing. But whether or not they will be able to come up with a satisfactory compromise on the trade issues is the critically important factor. And I don't think we know the answer to that yet definitively, but my assumption is that the president will be going there with that goal in mind, and the question is whether or not they can horse trade and work that out. But this personal relationship is not identical to a policy. And that's what we still cannot get from this administration, because the key people who need to be part of the policy process have not yet been appointed.
And I guess we also have this question of whether trade is in some way linked to North Korea, with what China produces on North Korea, as the president has sometimes suggested.
So for the question for me, so of course there's an alternative view, okay? Yeah, I would like to think that economists should be included among technocrats, by the way. So one small criticism of my friend is to distinguish between technocrats on the one hand and people with social science training on the other hand. But I guess the serious answer to your question is I'm not sure what makes a good president, but at the next level down, which would be, you know, secretary level in the US, state council level in China, I think you need real experts. And, you know, you need a diversity of them. You know, we've had scientists dealing with climate change issues, and I think that that's quite welcome. But I think if all of that minister level are engineers, I think that can create problems. And we did go through a period with China where it's just very hard to get the senior leaderships to think about economic solutions. I remember discussions about the trade imbalance where senior officials on the Chinese side would say, well, give us a list of products that we can buy, you know, and you know, we'll see what we can do. And that's just not an economic response to a policy problem. So I hope, I'm happy to have some engineers, but I hope we now have more diverse training on both sides of the Pacific.
And Richard gets the last word.
So I might say very quickly on trade, I think it's early days, US-China. The US is still embroiled in the NAFTA negotiations. The meeting in Beijing, as much as it's substantive, it would focus on the DPRK. Any trade-offs of that would be at the margins. The big fights, I think, lie ahead of us, assuming, as Stape says, the current administration actually develops a coherent policy that it can stick to. And on the engineering stuff, correct me if I'm wrong, I always thought that the reason why the Chinese leadership was so dominated by the engineers is because that was the safe thing to study, was it not, in the 50s and 60s? You didn't really dare study law or social sciences at that time. You studied engineering, and that seems to be a natural sort of changeover now in the qualifications of the Politburo and the Central Committee.
Great. Well, thank you very much to our panel. Thank you for being a great audience. And we will wrap up.